Imagine waking up on a cold metal table, your chest wide open, and looking into the eyes of something not human, something with claws, tendrils, and skin that shifts like smoke. You're dying. Your heart is exposed. And the only thing keeping it beating is an alien surgeon who's never touched a human body before. This isn't a rescue story. This is a story about what it means to be alive. Dr. Ravael was not born of flesh and bone. He came from a species known only in galactic archives as the Threxil, beings of fluid biology, translucent limbs, and a reputation for cold, calculated precision. For centuries, the Threxil refused to interact with humanity, deeming our emotional volatility a weakness. But Ravael was different. He was a healer first, a scientist second, and above all else, a seeker of truth. He had never met a human until that day. The day the escape pod crashed on the surface of Rila 3, tearing a line of smoke through the amber sky, and inside, barely breathing, was a human pilot. Female. Young. Fragile. Bleeding. Her name was Commander Elia Voss. Records would later show that she had diverted her ship to save a cargo vessel under alien attack, sacrificing her own safety. A foolish act, many said. But Ravael saw something else. He saw purpose. He saw pain. He saw a challenge unlike any he had faced in his centuries of healing. Her chest cavity had been crushed in the crash. 5 ribs broken. 1 lung collapsed. Her heart, her heart, was failing. And no one on the Threxil outpost had ever studied the human cardiovascular system. No one, except Ravael. He had once downloaded human anatomy files out of curiosity, intrigued by the redundancy of our organs, the bizarre need for both a brain and a separate emotional core, the heart. To the Threxil, such duality was chaos, inefficient. But now, standing over Elia, as her blood pooled and her heartbeat stuttered beneath his trembling manipulator limbs, Ravael didn't see chaos. He saw life. He made the decision in a second. Against Threxil protocol. Against the prime directive of non-intervention. He opened her chest fully, exposing the core of her being, and he held her heart in his alien hands. It pulsed weakly, like a wounded bird, struggling to fly. He could feel its rhythm through the thin layer of surgical interface gel, syncing briefly with his own bioelectric signals. It wasn't just a muscle. Not to humans. It was memory, emotion, grief, courage. And as he stabilized it with his artificial tendrils and began repairing torn vessels using nanofiber stitches, something shifted inside him. For the first time in his long, cold life, Ravael felt a surge of instinct, not calculation, not protocol, but something wild and ancient. He wanted her to live. He rebuilt her ribcage with an alloy she'd never recognize. He filtered her blood using methods that would terrify human physicians. And for 6 long hours, in silence broken only by the software of surgical drones, he worked. He sang once, an old Threxil medical hymn, a harmonic resonance meant to encourage tissue regeneration. It wasn't meant for humans, but somehow, her heart responded. Her pulse grew stronger. Her eyelids flickered. And then, she opened her eyes. The moment their gazes met, human and Threxil, time stood still. Elia didn't scream. She didn't recoil. She didn't even speak. She simply looked down, and saw her own heart beating in the alien's hands, as if he were cradling his soul. And she wept. Silent tears that glistened under the pale surgical lights. Not from pain. Not from fear. But because she knew, without a doubt, that this creature had saved her not out of duty, but something deeper. Something profoundly human. Ravael said nothing. He slowly guided her heart back into place, sealed the chest, and activated the final healing cocoon. He could have erased her memory, as Threxil law required. He didn't. Instead, he left her a message, carved into the alloy of her rib. You are worth saving. News of the incident spread like wildfire. At first, it was dismissed as propaganda. No Threxil would ever touch a human, let alone heal one. But then Elia returned to Earth. She carried scars not just of survival, but of connection. She spoke before the Galactic Council, holding a single transparent vial. Inside it, a Threxil surgical ring. Proof. And when asked why this alien saved her, she answered only this. Because I mattered. Not to humanity. Not to war. But to him. In the years that followed, Ravael was exiled from his kind. His name struck from the healer's registry. But he didn't vanish. Whispers across the stars told of an alien surgeon who roamed the edges of known space, fixing what others had given up on. And whenever someone asked why Threxil would risk so much for being so different, they would simply say, "He once held a human heart, and it beat for him." Commander Elia Voss did not return to her post immediately. Physically, she recovered in record time, thanks to the regenerative tech and surgical precision beyond anything humanity had yet conceived. But something deeper within her had changed. Every beat of her heart now echoed with the memory of that operating room, of the silence, of the alien song that had somehow wrapped itself around her soul. Her dreams were no longer her own. They were filled with flickers of Threxil symbols, sounds she had never heard, and feelings she couldn't explain. She didn't just survive. She was connected, altered. Back on Earth, military officials were quick to silence her. The alliance between humans and the Threxil had never existed, at least not officially. The Threxil were considered cold observers, never friends, never allies. But Elia's story shattered that narrative. When she refused to recant her testimony, when she displayed the surgical implant inside her ribcage live before the Interstellar Senate, the room fell into stunned silence. And then the questions came. Who was this surgeon? Why did he help? Was it a trap? A message? Or something more dangerous? A sign that even the most logical, emotionless beings in the galaxy could be moved by humanity? Galactic analysts debated it. Religious leaders interpreted it as a miracle. Scientists demanded access to her body, to her memories, to the alien alloy fused within her chest. She refused them all. "You don't understand," she told them, again and again. This wasn't science. This wasn't war. This was kindness. It was mercy without motive. But few in power were ready to believe her. Meanwhile, in the far reaches of the Orion expanse, Ravael wondered. His exile was not merely a legal punishment. It was a spiritual one. Threxil society operated on perfection, on patterns, on predictability. His choice to act emotionally, irrationally, marked him as defective. But he did not regret it. In fact, the more distance he put between himself and his former life, the more clearly he began to understand the pulse he had felt when holding Elia's heart. It hadn't just been a physical sensation. It had been resonance, a moment of understanding so pure, so raw, that it bypassed language, species, and history. And he wanted more of it. Ravael began following distress signals, human, alien, even artificial. Wherever there was suffering, he would appear. Uninvited, unknown. And each time, he would save a life. Not because he had to, but because he could. Whispers began to form, quiet legends on the back channels of space stations and abandoned colonies. They called him the surgeon of silence, the ghost healer, the one who holds hearts. Sometimes, he would vanish just before a patient awoke, leaving behind only a silver thread coiled like a DNA helix, a symbol known now to many as the thread of life. Other times, he would remain, watching from a shadowed corner, as his patient blinked open their eyes and stared into a face they did not recognize, yet somehow trusted immediately. Elia Voss became his advocate, his voice in the galaxy. She gave up her commission, burned her medals, and traveled to every system willing to listen. She spoke not of battle, but of healing, of the moment she looked into the face of a so-called monster, and saw something achingly familiar. Faith, compassion, hope. Her speeches were not always welcomed. Many called her a traitor, a fool romanticizing an enemy. But others listened. Other survivors began to speak up. Stories began to connect. A miner on Delta 7 who had a ruptured lung sealed in his sleep. A child on Mars Station whose failing immune system was cured by a glowing figure with hands of light. A diplomat's son, struck by a ray neural disorder, restored after a dream of a song in an alien tongue. Ravael had become something more than a surgeon. He had become a myth, a symbol. But he had one regret. He never saw Elia again. Not until the day she collapsed on the floor of the Galactic Assembly, mid-speech. Her heart, the one he had held, had begun to fail again. Not from trauma, but from time. The human body, after all, was still mortal, and her body had long surpassed the limits of even enhanced regeneration. She was dying, and everyone knew it. Except him. He felt it across the void. Whether by instinct or fate, he arrived at the assembly during the chaos. The guards didn't stop him. No one dared. Clad in his blackened robes, surgical appendages glinting in the sterile light, Ravael knelt beside her as she struggled to breathe. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the second time in her life, she looked into the face of the alien who had once cradled her heart in his hands. "You came," she whispered, voice barely audible. Ravael didn't answer. He didn't need to. He reached forward, slowly, reverently, placing one glowing palm over her chest. And then, for the first time in the history of the galaxy, before cameras, witnesses, and enemies alike, he sang the ancient healing hymn of the Threxil. But this time, it wasn't for regeneration. It wasn't for cellular repair. It was a farewell. Elia's heartbeat steadied for a moment. Her breathing calmed. A single tear rolled down her cheek. And then, peace. The galaxy mourned. Her funeral was the largest attended in Earth's recorded history. But what shocked everyone more than the mourning was what came after. Ravael, once exiled and reviled, was offered sanctuary, a seat, a title. He declined them all. Instead, he vanished once more, his only statement left carved into the wall behind the podium she once stood on. She was not one of many. She was one of one. And she reminded me that hearts, no matter their shape or species, are sacred. Years passed, but the story of Elia Voss and Ravael did not fade. Instead, it rooted itself into the very foundation of a new galactic consciousness, not through force, not through conquest, but through remembrance. Across countless systems, statues began to rise. Some sculpted from marble, others formed from living crystal that hummed with resonance. Each one different in form, but all depicted the same scene. A human woman lying wounded, and a Threxil figure kneeling beside her, cradling her heart with hands made not of flesh, but of light. They called it the moment of Macy. Children were taught about it in schools. Cadets at interstellar academies read her final speech. And in hospitals on both human and alien worlds, a small insignia began to appear beside surgical doors, a spiral of a heart enclosed within a six-fingered hand. It was not a symbol of medicine. It was a symbol of compassion beyond species, the unspoken oath passed down from Ravael to the universe. Every life matters. Even the unfamiliar. Even the feared. And it did not stop there. A new generation of doctors, both human and alien, inspired by Ravael's myth, began to push boundaries. Threxil medical knowledge, once tightly guarded and restricted, was now openly shared in neutral zones. Joint research stations were built, hovering between solar systems like bridges made of stardust and code. Medical drones equipped with both human empathy algorithms and Threxil nanogenics could now perform life-saving operations in the farthest, most dangerous reaches of known space. For the first time in galactic history, collaboration wasn't based on profit or military threat. It was based on shared fragility, shared pain, shared hope. Because no matter how many limbs you had, or what color your blood was, everyone bled. Everyone feared death. And everyone, deep down, wanted someone to fight for their life when they couldn't do it themselves. Ravael, however, remained a mystery. Some claimed to have seen him, a tall, robed figure standing at the edge of a collapsed colony, vanishing just as survivors were pulled from the rubble. Others spoke of a strange visitor to battlefield med tents, performing impossible surgeries and then disappearing into the smoke before anyone could thank him. A few skeptics insisted he had long since died, perhaps mourning Elia, perhaps consumed by the very system he had defied. But those who truly believed knew better, because on the 100th anniversary of Elia Voss's death, something impossible happened. A medical vessel, one stranded in a dying orbit above a radiation-racked moon, reported a system-wide blackout. All power had failed. Life support was dropping. Over a dozen critically ill patients would die within minutes. The crew sent out a last-ditch distress call, not expecting rescue, just wanting someone to know they existed. And then, the lights returned. Not flickering, not chaotic, but clean, warm, golden. The surgical lights came on, one by one. Systems hummed to life. And a faint song, one that didn't register on any frequency, but was felt by every living being on board, echoed through the walls. Not in words, not even in melody, but in meaning. When the crew reached the ICU, they found the patient stabilized, their vitals normalized, wounds healed beyond the limits of current science, and etched onto the metal wall behind the surgical table, in Threxil script, were 3 glowing words. Still holding hearts. It became the mantra of a movement. Still holding hearts. Printed on shirts, medical bags, stitched into uniforms. But more than that, it became a promise that no matter how far someone had fallen, how different they were, or how dark the world became, someone would still reach out. Still hold your heart. Still believe you're worth saving. In time, the myth of Ravael passed into legend. Some doubted he had ever existed. Others worshipped him as a divine being. But those who carried scalpels, who faced death every day in cramped hallways and deep space trauma wards, didn't need to see him to believe. They had their own moments of mercy, times when instinct overrode protocol, when a hand reached out, trembling, not in fear, but in hope. And somewhere, drifting beyond the edge of map space, in a vessel built from forgotten alloys and humming with soft resonance, an old surgeon sat alone. He no longer looked like the Threxil he once was. His form had changed, shaped by centuries of exposure to alien energies, to neural resonance, to the emotional feedback of thousands of lives he had saved. His hands, if they could still be called that, glowed faintly with every beat of every heart he had ever touched. And in his chest, where once a sterile core had pulsed with synthetic stability, now beat a heart. Not entirely human, not entirely Threxil, but something in between. Something new. He placed one hand over his chest, smiled, and whispered the last words Elia ever said to him. You came. And in the silence of deep space, for just a moment, the stars themselves seemed to pulse in time with his memory, beating softly, defiantly, like a heart. Centuries passed. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires that once controlled stars collapsed into dust, and new powers emerged in their place, wiser, humbler, shaped by the painful lessons of history. The age of conquest ended, not because of weapons, or treaties, or fear, but because of understanding. And at the center of that change was a single story, the story of the surgeon who held a heart. By the year 9841 PGC, post-galactic contact, the name Ravael was not just spoken with reverence. It had become a standard, a classification of ethical medical behavior. Ravael protocols were now taught to every species entering the Interstellar Medical Union, a core list of practices based on compassion over politics, mercy over mission, and healing over harm. In medical academies scattered across the galaxy, from the hydrogen cloud holes of the Andromeda Nebulae to underwater lecture domes beneath the oceans of cryoworlds, students of all species would begin their training with the same ritual. Each would be asked to place one hand, tentacle, claw, fin, or finger, over their own chest, close their eyes, and recite the oath of Ravael. Where there is life, I will see it. Where there is pain, I will answer it. Where there is difference, I will learn from it. And if ever I must hold another's heart in my hands, I will hold it as if it were my own. No one remembered who first wrote the words. Some claimed it was Elia Voss herself, in the final moments before her death. Others believed it was spoken spontaneously by Ravael to a dying patient, centuries later. But no one truly knew. And that was the point. The origin didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the meaning, and the millions who now lived because of it. Entire species who once viewed emotion as weakness had rewritten their societal codes to embrace empathy. Insectoid civilizations that once devoured the sick now kept hospice wards, built by human architects, operated by AIS who played soft Threxil healing harmonies through crystal fibers. Hive minds learned the concept of individual worth. Machine races programmed empathic subroutines. And in one extraordinary case, a medical android was granted sentient citizenship after declaring in court that it had felt a heartbeat not in wires, but in wonder. And yet, even in this enlightened future, a question lingered. Where was Ravael? Had he perished long ago, his body scattered among the stars? Had he ascended to some higher form, becoming pure resonance, floating between the pulses of time and memory? Or was he still out there, drifting silently in the unknown, waiting for the next heart to save? That question was answered not by scholars, nor prophets, but by a child. On the barren moon world of Velsura, where windstorms could peel skin from bone and night lasted 27 days, a 6-year-old girl named Hira wandered away from her settlement. Her lungs were weak, her heartbeat uneven. She had been born underweight, barely surviving the birthing cryopods. She didn't know the stories of Ravael. She only knew pain. Her tiny body collapsed in the dust, her breath too shallow to call for help. And then, she saw him. A figure made of shadow and shimmer, kneeling beside her. Long arms like sculpted starlight. A face she could not describe, but trusted immediately. She felt something cold and soft pressed to her chest. And then warmth. A warmth that wasn't skin deep, but soul deep, spreading through her ribs, into her lungs, into her pulse, until she could breathe again. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she was surrounded by rescue drones. No one believed her when she told them what she saw. No footprints. No drones. No medical record of anyone nearby. But when doctors scanned her chest, they found something impossible. One of her weak valves, previously scarred beyond repair, had been replaced. Not with tech, not with medicine, but with a perfectly grown organic replica. Engraved, deep within the tissue, visible only under a harmonic microscope, were the faintest lines. 3 words. Still. Holding. Hearts. And so, the galaxy moved forward, not with certainty, but with faith. Faith that somewhere out there, no matter how far lost, no matter how far fallen, someone was still listening, still watching, still ready to reach out across the stars and say, "You matter. You are worth saving." Because sometimes, it doesn't take an army to change the universe. Sometimes, it only takes a single pair of hands. And the courage to hold a stranger's heart. They called it the Age of Healing. Thousands of years after Ravael first held Elia's heart, the galaxy had evolved beyond what either of them could have imagined. War was not extinct, it never truly would be, but it had become rarer and harder to justify. Because now, before any conflict was sanctioned by planetary governments or interstellar coalitions, one single question was required to be answered in public hearing. Would Ravael have gone to war for this? It was not law. It was not enforced. And yet, it held weight greater than weapons. No side wanted to be the one history would record as having failed the healer's question. And so, diplomacy flourished. Empathy became currency. Entire galactic disputes were resolved not in courtrooms, but in shared memory chambers, where both parties would enter neural sync and feel each other's pain before judgment could be passed. This shift didn't begin with armies or legislation. It began with stories. Children on 1,000 worlds grew up reading tales of the human pilot and the alien surgeon, sometimes retold as fairy tales, other times as epic sagas. In one corner of the Triangulum cluster, a species of bioluminescent beings with no spoken language passed a story entirely through light pulsat, a glowing dance of color and memory that could bring even the most hardened soldier to tears. But the story was not always about glory. In some versions, Ravael was flawed, struggling to understand human emotion, haunted by the choices he made, isolated by the weight of compassion in a universe still learning how to carry it. In others, Elia wasn't just a hero, but someone burdened with survivor's guilt, questioning whether her life was worth the price paid to save it. And that honesty, that imperfection, made the story all the more powerful. Even artificial intelligences, once viewed as soulless, began to reference the legend. The most advanced healing constructs, designed to simulate empathy, used Ravael's neural blueprints as a base. And when asked why, the answer was chillingly consistent across systems. Because he didn't save to be remembered. He remembered to save. At the core of the Interstellar Memorial Hospital, built in the orbit of the dead world Grashtur, a planet once lost to plague but now reborn as a sanctuary, a monument was erected. It was simple. A stone table. A single stasis field hovering above it. And inside the field, a perfectly preserved human heart. Not Elia's. No one knew where her remains had gone. But this heart pulsed. Not mechanically. Not biologically. But symbolically. A gravity-modulated pulse beat within it. Slow, rhythmic, echoing through the chamber with each thump. And around the monument, inscribed in every known language, were 3 lines. One heart. One healer. Infinite echoes. Pilgrims came. Not just to look, but to remember, to place their hands on the monument and reflect, on lives lost, on lives saved, on what it meant to reach beyond fear and into faith. And sometimes, just sometimes, a visitor would report something strange. They'd say the chamber grew warmer, that the pulse of the heart matched their own for just a moment, that a voice, faint, distant, like wind across glass, whispered something they couldn't quite translate. But the feeling, stayed with them forever. One diplomat, after kneeling there for 3 hours in silence, cancelled a planned invasion that had been building for generations. When asked why, he simply said, "I remembered what it felt like to be held." There were those who still doubted Ravael's existence, who said it was all a constructed myth, designed to enforce peace through sentimentality. But those voices grew quieter with time, not because they were silenced, but because even they, in moments of fear, grief, or uncertainty, found themselves hoping that the surgeon of stars might still be out there, and in the farthest reaches of the galaxy, beyond explored space, in regions where even light hesitates to travel, strange things were still reported. A derelict medical ship, found adrift, with its entire crew miraculously healed and asleep in their beds. A battlefield where the wounded awoke to find their injuries repaired with unknown biotech, and a small, pulsing sphere left behind, humming softly in perfect sync with their heartbeats. And in the archives of an ancient, dying civilization that had never encountered humanity or Threxil, a prophecy etched in stone. When flesh fails and logic crumbles, a being of light shall come, with hands that cradle fire and songs that silence sorrow. They had no word for surgeon. They had never heard of Earth. But they knew. They knew. Because mercy echoes. And somewhere, out in the cold quiet between galaxies, where time forgets even the brightest stars, a single ship drifted. Its hull was silent. Its lights dim. But inside, one figure Saturday. Hands folded. Eyes closed. Listening. Waiting. Still holding hearts. 10,000 years after Elia Voss last opened her eyes, humanity had changed. No longer confined to a single form, humans now existed in myriad expressions. Flesh, biosynthetic hybrids, quantum minds suspended in crystal networks, light-based avatars walking the surfaces of stars. And yet, no matter how far they evolved, no matter how alien they became even to themselves, they all remembered him. The story had been passed down across generations not through books or screens anymore, but through something far more intimate, genetic memory. In the year 15,144 PGC, a breakthrough was made. Scientists discovered a small, seemingly insignificant gene sequence found in every human descendant, regardless of form or evolution. When activated through harmonic resonance, it triggered a cascade of emotional imagery, the feeling of being cradled while dying, the sound of a distant, mournful alien song, the warmth of two completely different life forms understanding one another without words. They named this sequence the Ravael strand. It became the foundation of an entirely new spiritual science, empathiogenetics. Beings of all species began integrating the Ravael strand into their own young, not to make them smarter, or faster, or stronger, but to give them the capacity to care. For the first time, compassion was no longer a learned behavior. It was inherited, and that changed everything. Species once bound by logic or instinct now raised young who paused before striking, who hesitated before harming. Not because it was programmed, but because deep inside them, echoing like the low thrum of a stasis cradle, was the memory of someone who held a stranger's heart with hands shaped like starlight. Entire star nations adopted the mark of mercy, a soft spiral traced around a single point, on their flags, ships, and clothing. To where it was to say, we are descendants of the held. We are children of the healed. But not all saw this evolution with joy. There were those who feared the erosion of strength, who believed that mercy made the galaxy weak. A faction rose, cold and calculating, composed of pure AIS and genetically filtered post-organics, calling themselves the Severed Hand. They moved through fringe systems like a virus, cutting out all traces of the Ravael legacy, burning monuments, silencing archives, even destroying memory caches. And yet, each time they thought the last tale had been erased, another would bloom elsewhere, spontaneously, from a child's dream, a poet's vision, or a data fragment re-emerging in a song played by solar wind harps. The story could not be killed, because Ravael's gift had not been a physical one. It had been a pattern, a waveform, a heartbeat. Once introduced, it pulsed outward forever. Even black holes, the dead hearts of collapsed stars, now had meaning to some cultures, who called them wounds of the cosmos, and believed that beyond their darkness was the place where Ravael now resided, cradling the forgotten, singing his wordless lullabies to lost souls no one else remembered. And then came the miracle. In the year 20,001 PGC, long after even the Threxil had vanished into evolutionary abstraction, a forgotten beacon on the edge of the universe reactivated. It sent no coordinates, no signal, just a single frequency, one that could not be translated, only felt. Those who tuned into it experienced visions, not of war or power, but of small things. A child's hand grasping a surgeon's finger, a pilot smiling through tears, an alien voice singing a song that didn't need a name. The broadcast ended with a pulse. 3 beats. Then silence. Galactic historians debated its origin. Technologists dismissed it as interference. But every healer, every caretaker, every soul who had once knelt beside the dying, wept. Without knowing why. Because they knew. Somewhere, beyond the veil of time and entropy, he was still there. Not as a man. Not even as a myth. But as a frequency. A rhythm. The idea of K, encoded into the heartbeat of the universe. Still watching. Still waiting. Still holding hearts.